The afternoon sun shone brightly over the city, casting golden reflections on the glass walls of Sterling Motors, one of the most prestigious luxury car dealerships in the state. Inside, the air smelled of leather and fresh polish. Rows of shining cars, sleek sedans, bold SUVs, and powerful sports cars stood ready for customers with the money and the confidence to claim them. Malcolm Reed stepped through the glass doors, quietly taking in the scene. He was a tall man in his early 40s, dressed in a simple navy sweater, faded jeans, and clean sneakers. There was nothing about his outfit that screamed wealth, and that was exactly how he liked it. He believed in letting people show their true colors before they knew who they were dealing with. As he strolled between the cars, his fingertips brushed over the smooth curves of a new black convertible. He knew every detail about this model: the horsepower, the engine build, even the stitching of the leather seats, because he had personally approved its purchase for the showroom. But to the staff, he looked like just another walk-in customer, maybe even someone who wouldn't be able to afford the monthly payments. From behind a counter, a young salesman glanced up at Malcolm and gave him a polite nod, but he didn't rush over. Instead, he stayed busy with his computer screen, perhaps waiting to see if this man was worth the effort. Malcolm didn't mind. He wasn't here to be treated like royalty. He was here to test drive the car he'd been eyeing for weeks. "Excuse me," Malcolm said with a warm smile, approaching the desk. "Could I take that convertible outside for a quick spin?" The salesman hesitated, his eyes briefly scanning Malcolm's sweater and sneakers before forcing a polite smile. "Ah, sure. Let me just get the keys. Do you have your license with you?" Malcolm nodded, pulling out his wallet. He handed over his driver's license, and the salesman walked toward the key cabinet. As Malcolm waited, the sound of tires crunching on the dealership's driveway drew his attention. A black and white police cruiser had pulled in. Stopping right in front of the showroom, two uniformed officers stepped out, one older, with a thick mustache and a sharp gaze, and the other younger, with a tense posture and restless eyes. They looked around for a moment before their eyes locked on Malcolm. It was as if they had found exactly who they were looking for, even though Malcolm had never seen them before in his life. The older officer entered first, his boots clicking loudly on the tiled floor. "Sir," he said firmly, walking straight toward Malcolm. "Can we see some identification?" Malcolm blinked, slightly confused. "I just gave my license to the salesman. I'm here too. We'll need to see it ourselves," the younger officer interrupted, his tone sharper than necessary. The salesman, holding the car keys, looked between Malcolm and the officers with wide eyes. Officers, is there a problem?" "That depends," the older cop replied, still staring at Malcolm. This gentleman was about to drive off in a vehicle worth over $100,000. "We just want to make sure everything is legitimate." Malcolm could feel the eyes of other customers turning toward him. He stayed calm, even as a knot began to form in his stomach. "I assure you," he said evenly, "everything is legitimate." But the officers didn't seem convinced. They exchanged a look, one that spoke of silent assumptions. The younger one stepped closer. "Sir, why don't you tell us what you're doing here?" Malcolm raised an eyebrow, his voice still controlled. "I'm here to buy a car." The older officer chuckled under his breath, as if that statement was amusing. "Right? Well, until we confirm that, we're going to need you to stay put." Outside, through the glass wall, a few passers-by began to slow down, sensing something unusual was happening inside. The sleek convertible still waited at the curb, its engine humming faintly, ready for the test drive that suddenly seemed very far away. Malcolm took a deep breath. He had been in situations like this before, moments where people judged him, not by his actions, but by the color of his skin and the clothes he wore. What they didn't know, and what he wasn't in a rush to tell them, was that this dealership, every car in it, and even the building itself, belonged to him. But, for now, he stayed silent, waiting to see just how far they would take this. The atmosphere inside Sterling Motors grew heavier with each passing second. The hum of the convertible's engine outside was now joined by the low murmur of customers whispering among themselves. Even the receptionist, who had been busy answering calls a moment ago, sat frozen, phone still in hand, watching the scene unfold. The older officer stepped closer to Malcolm, his hands resting on his belt in a show of authority. "Sir, we've had reports about suspicious activity in the area. A man matching your description was seen near a vehicle like this one. Care to explain?" Malcolm's brow furrowed slightly. "Matching my description." His voice remained calm, but there was a quiet firmness in it. "Officer, I walked in here like every other customer. I'm speaking to the salesman right now." The younger officer smirked faintly, as if he'd heard something he didn't believe. "Funny how people always have a story ready. That's a $120,000 car out there. Not exactly something you find at a budget lot." Malcolm didn't flinch. "I'm aware of the price. I was about to test drive it." The salesman, still holding the keys, shifted nervously from foot to foot. Officers. He gave me his driver's license. I was about to, son," the older officer interrupted sharply. "Why don't you let us handle this? We just need to make sure everything checks out." Malcolm could see the hesitation in the salesman's face. It was the look of someone torn between telling the truth and avoiding trouble. In that moment, Malcolm understood. The man didn't want to challenge the police, even if it meant letting an innocent customer be humiliated. "Officers," Malcolm began, his tone, "even if you're concerned, call the manager. He can confirm who I am." The younger cop crossed his arms. "We'll get to that. But first, we need to know, how exactly do you plan on paying for a car like this?" Malcolm met his gaze steadily. "That's between me and the dealership, unless you're here to buy a car too." A few people in the room chuckled quietly, but quickly fell silent when the older officer's eyes swept over them. "This isn't a joke, sir," the older cop said, his voice turning cold. "We're asking simple questions, and you're avoiding them. Why's that?" "I'm not avoiding anything," Malcolm replied, his voice still calm, but carrying more weight now. "I'm answering your questions. You just don't seem to like the answers." The younger officer's jaw tightened. "All right. I think we're done here. Put your hands behind your back." Gasps filled the room. The receptionist's hand flew to her mouth. The salesman's eyes widened in panic. "Wait, what?" "He didn't. Hands behind your back," the older officer ordered. Stepping forward, Malcolm sighed slowly, glancing around at the faces watching. He saw discomfort, pity, and a few expressions of quiet anger. But no one stepped forward. No one challenged the uniform. Without resistance, Malcolm turned around and placed his hands behind him. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the sound echoing in the now silent showroom through the large windows. The convertible gleamed in the sunlight, as if mocking the absurdity of the situation. Malcolm's mind stayed steady, even as the younger officer gripped his arm and guided him toward the exit. He could have stopped this at any moment by revealing the truth. But a part of him wanted to see just how deep these officers' assumptions ran, and how they would react when the truth finally came out. As they walked toward the door, Malcolm caught the salesman's eyes. The young man looked torn apart inside, his lips parting as if to speak. But before he could say anything, the older officer shot him a glare that froze him in place. Outside, a small group of onlookers gathered by the sidewalk, phones raised, recording. The younger officer glanced nervously at them but said nothing. The older one simply pulled open the cruiser's back door. Malcolm didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't shout. He simply stepped forward, his mind calm, because he knew that soon, very soon, the entire scene would turn upside down, and not in the way these officers expected. The warm afternoon air outside felt heavier than it had inside the showroom. Malcolm stood beside the police cruiser, the sun glinting off the silver handcuffs around his wrists. The younger officer kept a firm grip on his arm, while the older one scanned the growing crowd of bystanders. The dealership's driveway was no longer quiet. People from nearby stores had wandered over, curious about the scene. A few stood with their arms folded, watching intently. Others had their phones raised, recording every movement. Whispers passed through the crowd, each person trying to guess what was happening. Malcolm could hear fragments of their voices. Did he steal something? No, I think he was looking at one of the cars. Why would they arrest him for that? The convertible he had been moments away from driving sat only a few steps away, engine still humming softly. The sound seemed almost out of place, like a reminder of the normal afternoon he'd expected before everything changed. The younger officer pushed him gently toward the cruiser's back seat. "Watch your head," he muttered, though his voice lacked any trace of empathy. Malcolm glanced over his shoulder. Through the dealership's glass doors, he could still see the salesman standing frozen, keys in hand. His face was pale, torn, between fear of the police and guilt for saying nothing. Malcolm gave him a small nod, a silent message. "It's all right. I've got this." Just as the younger officer was about to guide Malcolm into the car, the dealership doors burst open. "Stop." The voice was sharp, commanding, and filled with authority. Every head in the crowd turned toward the man striding out, tall, well-dressed, and clearly in a hurry. It was the dealership's general manager, Mr. Hall. "What on earth is going on here?" Mr. Hall demanded, his eyes moving from the officers to Malcolm. The older officer straightened. "We're detaining this man for suspicious activity. He was about to drive off with one of your vehicles." "Suspicious activity?" Mr. Hall cut in, his tone rising. "That man is—" He stopped himself mid-sentence. Glancing quickly at Malcolm, Malcolm gave a subtle shake of his head. He wasn't ready to reveal it yet. Mr. Hall hesitated, then tried again, this time calmer, but still firm. "This gentleman is a valued customer. I authorized his test drive personally. You need to let him go." The younger officer frowned. "With all due respect, sir, we still have to confirm." "There's nothing to confirm," Mr. Hall snapped. "You're making a serious mistake." The crowd murmured louder now. Phones were still recording, and a few people were whispering to each other about how wrong the situation looked. Malcolm remained silent, his expression unreadable. Inside, though, he felt the shift in the air. The power in the scene was slowly moving away from the officers. But the older cop wasn't ready to back down. "Sir, we'll handle this. We just need to be sure this isn't a stolen vehicle situation. Please step back." Mr. Hall's jaw tightened. "No, you step back." His voice was low, but it carried a weight that made even the younger officer glance at him nervously. Still, the handcuffs stayed on Malcolm's wrists. The crowd's tension thickened, and someone in the back muttered, "This is ridiculous." Malcolm looked at Mr. Hall and finally spoke. "It's fine. Let them finish what they think they need to do." His tone was calm, almost patient. The older officer gave him a wary look, unsure why the man he was arresting seemed so confident. As Malcolm was guided the rest of the way into the back seat of the cruiser, he knew the truth would surface soon enough, and when it did, the same hands that had cuffed him would be scrambling to undo their mistake. The younger officer shut the door, the sound of it echoing through the driveway. The crowd kept recording, the tension far from over. Malcolm sat in the back of the cruiser, eyes steady, heart calm. He was waiting for the moment that would turn their assumptions upside down, and he knew it was coming. The sound of the cruiser door closing still hung in the air when Mr. Hall stepped forward again, his face pale but determined. He was a man who had worked in the dealership business for over 20 years, and he had never been this angry on the job. His eyes stayed locked on the older officer. "Open that door," Mr. Hall said, his voice firm. The older officer shook his head. "Sir, we're in the middle of police business. Please step back and let us do our job." Mr. Hall didn't move. "Your police business is about to become the biggest mistake of your career." The younger officer crossed his arms, frowning. "Sir, we've explained." "No, you haven't explained anything," Mr. Hall cut in sharply. "You walked in here, saw a man looking at a car, and decided he didn't belong. That's all this is." The crowd murmured in agreement. Phones were still pointed at the scene, recording every second. The weight of being on camera was starting to sink in for the younger officer, who kept glancing nervously toward the people filming. The older officer, however, stayed rigid. "Look, if you know this gentleman, you can tell us his name, and we'll confirm it." Mr. Hall's lips pressed into a thin line. He looked over at Malcolm, still sitting calmly in the back seat. Malcolm's eyes met his, and once again, he gave the faintest shake of his head. He wasn't ready for the reveal. Not yet. Mr. Hall took a deep breath. "Fine. You want his name. His name is Malcolm Reed." The older officer scribbled it down on a notepad. "All right. And he's a customer?" Mr. Hall's next words made the crowd collectively lean in. "No, he's not just a customer." The younger officer tilted his head. "Then who is he?" Mr. Hall took a step closer, his voice low but carrying enough force for everyone to hear. "He's your boss, and my boss. He owns this dealership. In fact, he owns every Sterling Motors location in this state." The crowd erupted into gasps and whispers. Several people turned to each other in disbelief. The salesman inside the showroom slapped a hand over his forehead, realizing the truth he had almost blurted out earlier. The younger officer's face flushed red, and his eyes darted toward the cameras. The older officer stiffened, his expression faltering for just a second before he quickly covered it with a frown. "We still need to verify that," he said, though the firmness in his voice was gone. "Go ahead," Mr. Hall replied coldly. "Call corporate, call the bank, call anyone you want, but you're going to look real foolish when they tell you that you just handcuffed the man who signs all our paychecks." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, and a few people laughed in disbelief. Someone near the front said, "Man, this is going online. It's already halfway viral." The younger officer's hand twitched near the handcuffs at his belt, as if he wanted to unlock them immediately, but the older one gave him a warning look. It was clear they were now trapped in a situation where every move they made would be judged and recorded by dozens of strangers. Malcolm, meanwhile, sat silently in the back of the cruiser, watching the scene unfold with steady eyes. His heart wasn't racing, his breathing was calm. He knew exactly how this would end, and he wanted the lesson to be as public as possible. Mr. Hall folded his arms, his voice low, but full of controlled anger. "I've worked for Malcolm Reed for years. I've never seen him lose his temper. Not once. But if you think for a second that this will go away quietly, you're wrong. You embarrassed the wrong man today." The older officer's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The younger officer shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. Finally, Malcolm spoke for the first time since Mr. Hall's reveal. His voice was calm, but it carried a certain gravity. "Go ahead, officers. Make your calls. I'll wait." And with that, silence fell over the driveway, broken only by the clicking of phone cameras and the low hum of the convertible's engine, still waiting for the drive that had started this whole mess. The older officer stepped a few feet away, pulling out his radio. His voice was low, but the crowd could still catch bits of it. "Run the name Malcolm Reed. Cross-check with Sterling Motors, corporate ownership records." He turned slightly, so that he wasn't facing the cameras, but there was no hiding the tension in his posture. The younger officer remained near the cruiser, glancing at Malcolm through the glass. His hands rested on his belt, but his stance had shifted from authority to discomfort. The longer the silence stretched, the more obvious it became that the officer's confidence was cracking. Mr. Hall stood beside the car, his arms folded, his eyes never leaving them. The crowd stayed quiet now, sensing that something big was about to happen. Only the clicking of phone cameras and the soft hum of the convertible's engine broke the stillness. Malcolm leaned back in the seat, his face calm but unreadable. Inside, he thought about all the times in his life when people had assumed they knew who he was, and how often those assumptions were wrong. It didn't matter how much money he made, how much he gave to charity, or how much respect he earned. In business, some people only saw what they wanted to see. The older officer's radio crackled. A voice came through, muffled but clear enough to be heard by the people closest to him. Confirmed. Malcolm Reed, owner of Sterling Motors. Multiple locations statewide. Net worth listed in corporate records. No criminal record. The officer froze for half a second before replying. Copy that. When he turned back toward the cruiser, the hard edge in his expression was gone. It had been replaced by something else, something he clearly didn't want the cameras to catch. Regret. Mr. Hall's voice was sharp. Well, you heard them. Take off the cuffs. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, looking at his partner for permission. The older one hesitated, glancing around at the phones still recording from every angle. It was clear he hated the idea of admitting he'd been wrong in front of so many witnesses. Malcolm met his gaze through the window, then slowly spoke. It's all right. You can take them off. The older officer opened the cruiser door, his tone now stiff and formal. Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience. He reached for the cuffs, fumbling slightly as he unlocked them. The cold metal loosened from Malcolm's wrists, and for the first time since the incident began, Malcolm was free to move. As he stepped out of the cruiser, a ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. A few people clapped softly, others shook their heads at the absurdity of what they'd just seen. Malcolm rubbed his wrists, not in pain, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the humiliation he'd endured. Then he looked at the officers and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. You didn't ask who I was. You didn't treat me like a customer, or even like a man. You made assumptions based on nothing but your own ideas of what I could or couldn't afford. That's not just bad policing. That's dangerous. The younger officer's face burned red. The older one's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Malcolm turned slightly toward the crowd. This isn't just about me. Every person you see, every stranger you meet, could be more than they seem. Treating people with respect costs you nothing. Judging them unfairly can cost you everything. There was a beat of silence before someone in the crowd said, That's right, followed by a few others murmuring their agreement. The convertible still sat waiting, its glossy black paint reflecting the sunlight. Malcolm looked at it for a moment, then at Mr. Hall. Let's take that test drive now. The crowd chuckled, the tension finally breaking. But as Malcolm opened the car door, he knew this moment wasn't over. The cameras had captured everything, and soon the entire city, maybe even the whole country, would see exactly how a simple afternoon at a car dealership had turned into a lesson on respect, dignity, and assumptions. The moment the handcuffs came off, the energy in the dealership's driveway shifted completely. The crowd's earlier tension melted into quiet anticipation. Everyone could feel it. The balance of power had changed. Malcolm stood tall beside the cruiser, rubbing his wrists once before letting his hands fall naturally to his sides. The younger officer stepped back, almost as if giving him space, while the older one avoided direct eye contact. Mr. Hall was the first to speak. Malcolm, I'm so sorry. I should have stepped in sooner. Malcolm gave him a small nod. You did what you could. The rest, well, I wanted them to see it through. The younger officer cleared his throat, his voice quieter than before. Sir, we didn't mean any disrespect. We were just Malcolm's gaze, cut to him, calm but sharp. Just what? Doing your job. Your job isn't to judge someone before. You know the facts. It isn't to assume that because I'm dressed in a sweater and jeans, I can't afford the car I'm looking at. Your job is to protect and serve. But today, all you did was profile and accuse. The words landed heavy, not just on the officers, but on the crowd too. People exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement. The older officer shifted uncomfortably. "Sir?" Malcolm held up a hand, stopping him. "You don't need to explain to me, but you will have to explain to everyone else watching when this video goes online." He gestured toward the people still holding up their phones. "Because I promise you, this won't just disappear." There was a ripple of murmurs in the crowd. A few people even clapped quietly. Then, instead of walking away, Malcolm took a step closer to the onlookers. He raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Let me tell you something. Respect should not depend on what someone looks like. It should not depend on the clothes they wear, the color of their skin, or the kind of car they drive. It's something you give because you're human, not because you've judged someone to be worthy of it." The camera zoomed in on him. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't angry. His voice was calm but powerful, carrying a weight that made people lean in to listen. "I could have told these officers the truth from the very beginning," Malcolm continued. "I could have ended this before it even started. But sometimes, the best way to show people their mistake is to let them walk all the way into it." The older officer's face was unreadable now, but the younger one's eyes shifted to the ground. Mr. Hall stepped beside Malcolm, clearly standing with him. "Everything he's saying is true," he told the crowd. "I've worked for him for years, and I've seen him treat everyone, employees, customers, even strangers, with the same respect. That's the kind of leadership that built Sterling Motors. And that's why this moment matters." Malcolm nodded slightly at him before turning back toward the convertible. The keys were still in the salesman's hand. The young man approached, almost hesitantly, and offered them with a guilty look. "Sir, I'm sorry," the salesman said quietly. Malcolm took the keys but didn't smile. "You had a chance to speak up. Next time, don't be afraid to do the right thing, even if it's uncomfortable." The salesman swallowed hard and nodded. Malcolm opened the driver's side door and slid into the leather seat. The crowd instinctively shifted to give him space. As the engine's low rumble grew louder, he looked out the window toward the two officers. "One last thing," he said. "You don't get to decide someone's value by looking at them. You learn it by listening to them." With that, he shifted the car into gear. The convertible rolled smoothly out of the dealership lot, the sunlight gleaming off its polished surface. The crowd watched as Malcolm drove away, not just as the owner of Sterling Motors, but as a man who had just turned an embarrassing moment into a public lesson no one would forget. 2 days later, the video from the dealership had spread across the internet like wildfire. It had been shared millions of times, played on news channels, and discussed in coffee shops, offices, and living rooms all over the country. In every version of the clip, the same moment stood out. Malcolm Reed stepping out of the police cruiser, looking calm and composed, and speaking about respect as dozens of cameras recorded him. That morning, a crowd gathered outside Sterling Motors' main location. Customers, reporters, community leaders, and curious onlookers filled the parking lot. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed toward the sky. Everyone was waiting for Malcolm's first public statement since the incident. When he stepped out of the building, he wasn't wearing an expensive suit. Instead, he wore the same navy sweater and jeans from that day, a quiet reminder that his worth had never depended on clothes. The murmurs in the crowd died down as he approached the microphone set up in front of the dealership. "Good morning," Malcolm began, his voice steady but warm. "I want to thank everyone for coming. I also want to thank the people who recorded what happened the other day. Without you, the truth might have been buried." He paused, letting the cameras click and the microphones hum. "What happened at my dealership was not about me being rich. It was not about me being the owner. It was about how quickly some people decide who you are before they know your name, before they know your story, before they know anything about you." A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. Reporters scribbled notes, some already typing his words into their live feeds. I could stand here and tell you I'm angry, Malcolm continued, but anger doesn't build anything. Respect does, understanding does, change does, and that's why I'm here. He looked out over the crowd, making eye contact with people in every direction. This isn't just about two officers. It's about a way of thinking that hurts people every day, in stores, in schools, at jobs, and on sidewalks. A way of thinking that says, I've already decided what kind of person you are, and nothing you say will change my mind. That is wrong, that is dangerous, and it has to end. A woman in the crowd clapped softly, and soon others joined until the sound rolled through the parking lot. Malcolm held up a hand for quiet. I want you to remember something. Every stranger you meet is a story you haven't read yet. Don't assume you know the ending before you've even turned the first page. His words hit the crowd like a wave, quiet, steady, and impossible to ignore. I also want to say this, he added, his voice softening. The officers involved have reached out to me. They apologized. I accepted their apology, but not because what happened was small. I accepted it because if I can't believe people can change, then everything I'm saying today is empty. That drew a round of applause, and a few people even stood. I'm not here to ruin careers or make enemies, Malcolm said. I'm here to make sure the next person who walks into a dealership, or a store, or anywhere else, doesn't have to prove they belong there just because of the way they look. He stepped back from the microphone for a moment, letting the applause swell, before returning for one last thought. I love this city. I love the people in it. And I believe we can do better. Respect is free. Give it freely, and you'll be surprised at how much it pays you back. The crowd rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. Cameras flashed as Malcolm stepped away from the microphone. He didn't wave, didn't pose. He simply walked back into the dealership, the same way he had walked into it the day of the incident. But now, the world knew exactly who he was. Not just a wealthy businessman, but a man who had turned humiliation into a lesson that would be remembered far beyond the walls of Sterling Motors.